Good morning, Tashi Dele, and welcome to you all. And once again, I would really like to begin today's session by thanking Tushita for this invitation. Very, very precious center. And thank you very much to Nico here for organizing, Yash, and everybody who has made this possible. It's a real privilege. So we'll just begin by setting our proper motivation to think about why we are here, why we've come to attend the teachings today or discussion really. What is our goal? So I think our goal would be to attain a kind of state of perfect enlightenment and try to remove all that hinders us along the way, all the different kind of afflictive obscurations, cognitive obscurations. And we really hope for the support of positive causes and conditions and, to make this possible. So with that, I'd also like to say the refuge prayer, and please join me. Sangye chodang sogi chognam la, jangcho badu dagni kyapso chi, dagi jinso gipe soknam ki, dola venture sangye dupar shok. Sangye chodang sogi chognam la, jangcho badu dagni kyapso chi, dagi jinso gipe soknam ki, dola venture sangye dupar shok. Sangye chodang sogi chognam la, jangcho badu dagni kapso chi, dagi jinso gipe soknam ki, dola fenche sangye dupa shok. So just to recap, this is the third of a final set of 3 discussions. To recap, in the first discussion, we spoke really about, what is the possibility, how economics as a discipline, because that's how I've been trained. I have been a professor of political economy, and I still am in some senses. So I took that discipline also because it has had a huge impact on the world and continues to do so, disproportionate, and also picked up evolutionary biology and what that has to say. And the reason for doing both of this is that they posit human nature in a certain way, which is individualistic, which is competitive, which is self-interested. And the discussion led to, I talked about the frontiers of these disciplines now, where there is an increasing questioning about this formulation of a certain kind of a homo economicus in the case of economics, or a Darwinian being this survival of the fittest notion that, we need anger and competition and jealousy and many other things in order to survive. So there was a questioning of all that. And why is that important? Because we were discussing that finally how we posit human nature. If we say that, and we concluded that where these disciplines stand, and most disciplines would stand, neuroscience, primatology, other kinds of disciplines, that perhaps we have a mix of these positive and negative kind of characteristics. So then the question came that, why was this important? Because if we are talking about having these potentials as our own internal state and something that we can develop vis-a-vis an external regulatory force, be it a creator God, be it a state, that imposes limits on our actions, then the two implications are very, very different, right? Because if we are saying that our human nature has compassion, has many of these positive qualities, and indeed we can grow them infinitely, then how we are going to think about our lives and, even how we are going to think about developing these is very different from if it's coming from some kind of external imposition. So that was the first talk. The second talked a lot about compassion. I picked that up as a particular universal ethic. And there the key thing was that we talked about its definition. I shared why this tradition has really appealed to me personally, as somebody who loves things to be very defined and particular and concrete, and something I can, get into, because the thing about that is then you have very concrete steps in order to how to proceed, where are you at and where are you going to go? And actually you even have a roadmap. So we talked about compassion, and we talked about how, there are many kind of misapprehensions. So normally we always think about compassion as something that is helping others. And indeed, if we think about our mind, when we are starting to think about it, we already feel a little bit of do-goody and also tired, because we feel that it is detracting from our own happiness, our own time, our own interests, and all of that. And so can we, think about that differently? If we link behaving compassionately, and I use the word compassionately, I gave many definitions, and I also spoke about the English language having its limitations in terms of the meaning that comes from such a word. So you can, replace that with in your different languages if you have access. But we talked about, how if you think about it as relating to your own happiness, then how, again, we choose to pursue it and develop it is very different. And this is more realistic. It is more stable, because, again, I spoke personally that for me, the moral argument about, we also shared that animals are very compassionate, right? So it cannot just be a religious value. That there are cases, you see many, like at times animals have taken in other wild animals and from different, species also to look after them and care for them and all. And therefore, if compassion and all was a religious value, we wouldn't see that sort of thing, right? And our anthropocentric view has also always driven it in that direction. But here the point is, if you link compassion to your own happiness, then again, how you pursue it will be very different. It will be very stable from the kind of little bit of exhaustion. And this comes from my students' questions that, ma'am, Mother Teresa was great. Nelson Mandela was great. His Holiness is amazing, but I don't think I can become them. So the question is, can we become them? And if it is that, then what we do with our human lives is extremely important, because we have that same potential. So that was, discussions 1 and 2. And now we are the last. And we also touched upon the cognitive change, so how to generate this compassion. And I'm going to go over that because there may be, again, new people here. I think the talks are on YouTube, so that if anybody wants to. But I will start by, because this time we are going to talk about dependence, interdependence, dependence, and the flip side, which is the philosophy of the wisdom of emptiness, which is at the heart of, the topic for today's chat really is why, in light of this ontological reality, we may be able to develop compassion infinitely, tirelessly, with the greatest amount of courage. And why, personally, for me, if you ask how I ended up from a professor in political economy, which I still am sort of, but pursuing this path as a very personal one, what drove me there? So it is this possibility and this, kind of understanding. So this is Arya Nagarjuna in Tibetan Gompo Lundup. He is seen as perhaps the greatest interpreter of the Buddha's words in terms of, when the Buddha gained enlightenment for 49 days, he was quiet and he refused to give teachings, because he said that what I have discovered, not what I have invented, but what I have discovered is, so kind of sophisticated, so nuanced, that I really don't see how I'm going to, there may be few beings who are actually able to understand and get, and therefore it doesn't really make sense for me to immediately start teaching. But then he does, right? And so Arya Nagarjuna is seen as the way to really unfold the profundity of the Buddha's teachings as regards emptiness, in the most profound way. So we will start by just a verse that is the, his key text, the fundamental wisdom of the middle way, which requires quite a lot of study in this tradition. The PhD degree, which also, just shocked me when I first heard it, is 22 years, right? The Geshe-la Rampa is 22 years. And trust me, having done a PhD in Cambridge, I know what the comparison, there's no comparison in terms of the degree of toughness and also of this. So you can imagine. So here he unfolded his text, The Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, needs a lot of other interpretive texts. And he lived in the 1st century, and by some accounts, by his uncommon biography, he had a very, very long life. He had different powers like alchemy and all, but in his common biography and what we can see, he's left a legacy that resonates to today. So the heart of this fundamental wisdom of the Middle Way text is these 2 verses, which right at the end of today we will touch upon. That which dependently originates is posited to be empty of independent existence. That being dependently designated, this is the middle way. Since there is no phenomena that is not dependently originated, therefore there is no phenomena that is not empty. And here we will come to it later. I just wanted to set that out right at the beginning, that again, when we see these verses, we can see that there is something here that all of us, if we have the opportunity, can sink our teeth into, can actually start thinking and learning about. And it presents a certain view of ontological reality that today physics is coming very close to. I would say physics has still not, in fact, got where Arya Nagarjuna was without all the instruments and the technological sophistication that we have today. So, we just keep the Buddha's head. Yeah, that's good. Sorry. You'd rather see his head than mine. Okay, so now we said that, and I want to really impress upon this, that one's own happiness is increased by being compassionate. We discussed this last time, and I'm really saying it because, again, the words happiness and all, we discussed this last time. It's a little bit, we just have to make do with it. And we said that, it can be, you can use different words, contentment, this and that. It's not that way very satisfactory. But what is very important to try to really gain conviction that our happiness is increased by being compassionate. So there is a great, one of the teachers of this Nalanda tradition, Bodhisattva Shantideva, who says, whatever joy there is in this world all comes from desiring others to be happy. And whatever suffering there is in this world all comes from desiring oneself to be happy. And here, as the Buddha said, just examine my words, test them. And, last time or last to last time, there was a question by Simar, and he asked about, the operation of the law of karma and how this is hard to discern. But one thing I would say is that whichever of the Buddha's words, there are different kinds of phenomena, right? They believe manifest, hidden, and very hidden, right? So let us first gain conviction in the manifest and the slightly hidden, where we can, by our own experience, our own study, our own inference, we can gain conviction. And then things like karma, which is very hidden, then we can just by the extension or extrapolation say that the Buddha must also have been, correct about these, because he has been correct about these very, very deep and profound things, right? So first, let us attempt that. So here, what Bodhisattva Shantideva is saying, and if you remember the first 2, it's not very different from what Bertrand Russell, and in fact, even Adam Smith said in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. If you remember the first 2, those, they are also talking about something that what he is saying. And we discussed last time that, it's totally fine to want your happiness. And let's be honest with ourselves, because that's the starting point. So we want happiness, and this happiness of the short-term sensorial pleasures, like I said last time, it's so lovely. Tushita Center, cool, beautiful. We are sitting here. There's, it's not in a hot, dusty, construction site that I'm sitting and everything. So yes, sure, we need a minimal level of income, as Amartya said, and, everybody would agree in this room. And I would myself personally agree that these are things we want to aspire to. It's fine to aspire to. But this becomes a problem if we see that as the be all and end all, and this short-term kind of, thing where, as Amartya Sen and others said, that, income is a means to an end. It's not the end. And our happiness does not increase proportionally with our wealth. Otherwise, the simple proof, and again, use your logic here, please. is that, you know, all the wealthy countries in the world and all the wealthy people in the world would be the happiest. And we don't see that, right? The rates of depression are the highest in some of the wealthiest countries of the world, and suicides. So we don't need some, you know, magical thing. We can draw our own inference. But then we said that being wisely kind to yourself is going deeper. And if we see this dependency and the nature of reality, ontological reality, perhaps there is a possibility that for us to now go about creating causes for future happiness. So this is something we really don't want to do. Recently, it has been dawning on me one thing, that the first is happiness as a resultant state, right? Today, the fact that I am not sitting, and last time I spoke a lot about Rafah and Gaza, and I want to reiterate here that I wasn't taking per se a political position, but I was saying it's extremely good for students and academics to identify with the suffering of others across the world, women, children, all of that. And as somebody raised a question, it would be good if we did it for everywhere, you know, Sudan and Ukraine, and, you know, without bias. But be that as it may, what I was raising there is that identify with others, see their suffering, right? So now we all want resultant happiness, and I'm sitting here I came beautifully. I had a nice breakfast. First, I listened to His Holiness in the morning in my cozy home with like technology working. There's no bomb falling on my head. I don't have to queue with 1,000 people. I'm not like desperate, you know, in so many different ways, internal and external. So that's my resultant happiness, right? We all want that, and that's fine. But are we going around creating causes for the happiness? Because this is number 2. And this again relates to class 1 and 2 or discussion classes. Sorry, my hangover as a teacher. Please apologies. I'm no type of teacher in this setting. I'm like as much a student as anybody else, but I'm just... so in the first 2 sessions, we discussed that creating the causes, this is something, if we are saying that we have the potential and there is no external factor that is, you know, controlling and this, then we have complete agency to now do things that create future happiness. But do we want to do that? Takes effort, right? And I also feel that sometimes what appealed to me about this path really is that finally it puts the power in your hand. It puts the remote control in your hand. Madam, you want to have good future life. You are the master of your own self. Who else? This is the Buddha's words. But when we don't want to take that responsibility, then we are, you know, creative. Somebody external, somebody save me, some guru, something, right? So we really have to think about this, because this will operate only with a lag. And what are the tricks? Because if we think about the long-term situation, because this life is just, you know, in this framework, if you particularly believe in rebirth, and a lot of Indic traditions do, then this life is the smallest unit. It's a much longer frame of reference. So then last time we said that His Holiness, he himself and I myself have also this, in these series, we are talking about compassion as a secular universal value. And he has been the foremost propounder of universal values. Beyond Religion is the name of his book. So the title is self-explanatory, you know. Again, there was a question related to that, you know, about religion and last time. But the fact is that, you know, he says, and it's true, that in the age of science and the youth of today, and even otherwise, perhaps let's see if we can go beyond, because religion has had a chance for thousands of years, and yet we keep fighting and killing each other over this, right? So let's set that aside now. That's your personal business. Here we are talking about, you know, universal values and what is required. And there are 2 basic principles, which is our common humanity and the shared aspiration for happiness and suffering, right? That me, the dog on the road, the ant on the Tushita pavement upstairs, we all want happiness. We all don't want suffering. If I'm coming to step on it, it tries to move away instinctively. We want, you know, safety. We want water. We want food. We want everything. There's no difference. And humanity, as I said last time, I would like to keep the anthropocentric, all sentient beings, you know, because I mean, not this anthropocentric view, sorry, but one that includes other beings, all, you know, sentience. And then if we understand dependence as a key feature of our human reality as biological animals, and, the first session, the electricity went, but I think you can find that clip of David Attenborough, Emperor Penguins. It's very, very sweet. There I was showing, how even now the animal world and others show that, cooperation may be a much better trait to develop than competition. Competition will first kill you, because as we said in the slide number, whichever, that, the excessive use of the words I and mine, now there's scientific studies linking that to more heart disease, heart attacks, all of that. So first, it's going to kill you to be endlessly competitive with others. And secondly, so this Darwinian notion that, as we discussed that time, that, what are the fallacies, and perhaps he never even meant it himself. Herbert Spencer and others ran with the ball. And, therefore, this whole, sort of like what you may call power in, epistemology, knowledge, what we see as valid, not all of that operating there. But this cooperation might be something that is far more useful to us as individuals, as whatever unit we take, The European Union. I lived in Britain for 13 years at the University of Cambridge. And, the day Brexit happened, it was tragedy. And now it's all unfolded, right? Where have they got so ahead by just being in their own individual unit? So you can apply this to many, many levels. And therefore, cooperation might be a better trait. And that Emperor Penguin video shows it very sweetly, because in the cold, in order to survive, they all have to cooperate. And how they do this, of course, is the magic of David Attenborough. And it's beautiful. And this was one of my science students who bought this video clip. But if you Google it, it's there already. So now if we see these two principles that we can all accept, then on this basis, we can think about, compassion and other states. Now, we spoke last time about what is compassion. And we said it's a mental factor, mental. It's not some emotional, I start crying when I'm driving past Ames, when I see all the hundreds of people stuffed in there looking for health. Just I drove now, and I've been there myself. So mental factor of love and affection, which wishes others to be freed of suffering and the causes of suffering. So we discussed this last time, that you don't just see the suffering, you also see the causes of the suffering. And this is a little bit hard for us with modern education, particularly me also, as somebody who was part of an international relations department. And, when I see geopolitics and all, to really feel, compassion for those who are creating the causes of suffering. And in this context, I spoke about a lot of world leaders today. And we spoke about tech gurus and all their activities. And we said we need to generate a little bit of compassion for them as well, because although we see them as very powerful, having a very good life, they have money, they have this, they have that, and they have power, where are they going with this? We need to think about this, right? And this is again linked to be wisely kind to yourself and think about, because those who are doing great things and who are role models and everything, we don't really need to actually say, forget about prayers for them. We don't even need to, they are quite managing with their own causes and conditions. They are going at a higher level. So for them, we don't need to, create. So His Holiness is often giving the advice. I've heard him, people have asked him in public that, they can't get over the death of a close loved one, near one, dear one. And he said that, their mother and all also. And he said that just remember all the good things that they did in their life. Think about that. Think of replicating that, and that they also have the possibility in the future rebirth to, do that on a much larger scale, and then, let it go. No need to feel worried. So, but here we are talking about, those creating the causes of suffering for themselves and for many, many others. And we said that it's the flip side. Obviously, you need to love and care. The affectionate loving, that a state of mind which wishes whoever we encounter, so no, sorry, the flip side of this is loving kindness, right? That you want them to have happiness and the causes of happiness. So that's two things. And here we said that we are saying now that, you see beings in an attractive light, just as a mother sees her only child. Now we'll come to this, because the other thing that attracted me about this tradition is that possibility to do it yourself. And what is the roadmap? Because if there is none of the two, then why am I sitting here? Let me go and have nice noodles in Hoskas on Saturday morning. And thank you all for not going to noodles. Go chill out, enjoy your life, just carry on, as all the people who don't believe in cause and effect and everything else, and possibly even rebirth and all, then, and rebirth, that's a whole different, beyond my pay grade, to be honest, to get to talk about that too, because you'll have to go to some more, my own teacher, Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdol and Tibetan House and others. But so here we are seeing our own possibilities. So we'll come to how, what are we aiming for and how do we do it? And if we have answers to that, again, it has implications for our life, right? Our present life, our daily life. So here, of course, though, there's another stages of meditation as cited in Lamrim Chenmo by Lama Tsongkhapa, that once the mental continuum has been made moist with the water of love, it is like the fertile soil in which the seed of compassion once planted with freely thrive. So here, let's again just think and take a moment to, think about how beautiful and how in depth they have thought about these various steps. And you could say causal factors, right? If we put it, it's simply causal factors that before you generate compassion, you need to generate love. And we use these words very freely, and then here, then there's a really fine-tuned, like A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, right? So then we say that the generation of compassion needs two elements: your love for other sentient beings and your seeing the suffering and the causes of suffering. So there are these two elements that we need. And now let us see that, can we develop these and how? Because otherwise, as I'm saying, please, your Saturday morning, good dosa in Cafe Karnataka with a coffee and then just hang out with friends or do whatever. Because we are having the present circumstances of happiness, all the people listening online and this, we are not having some great manifest suffering that is stopping us from doing. So let's just enjoy that and, try to, then no point to waste time. So now this for me, and here I'm really talking this whole 3 days, I'm tried to share a little bit whatever I have picked up and tried to, think about studying this philosophy now for a decade, but more also in discussion with my students, because I did teach this as a half-term course outside my discipline, and they raised some questions and all. But my own my mind stream, as an academic and everything. So intellectually accepting something is very easy, right? Now, turning that into something deeper is not easy. And we all, like intellectually, we all understand impermanence. We all understand that, right now there could be a bomb here and that's it. But do we really live our lives as if it is impermanent, right? It is so not easy. So here the question comes then that, we may share a common sentience. We may concede that, yes, me and all other sentient beings, they want happiness. They don't want suffering, all of that. But can we start loving first? I love myself. We star in a Bollywood film, even in our dreams, right? We are the leading star. It's I. Even in our dreams, everything is going around us. Then after that, my near and dear ones, right? Now we are talking here that after that, we'll think about neutral people, and then we'll even start thinking about difficult and enemy people, which, His Holiness has done with the CCP and all. Is this possible? And let's see if it is. And anyway, at least we can think about the, so then for this, understanding how the mind works is very critical. So we said last time, and this I'm just because we covered this last time, and as I shared previously as well, I have been studying at Tibetan House, Delhi for the last decade. And really a lot of this is based on, Geshe La's teachings, Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdol, and whatever other I have picked up, and I'm sorry, but all mistakes here are completely from my side, So if we think about psychology, there are these omnipresent mental factors, that accompany. So we said it's contact, attention, discrimination, feeling, and intention. And we said here that, so first you have a contact with an object, you pay attention to it. This cup is now coming to my mind. Then you discriminate, discern that, this is it's a cup, right? That's a cognitive function. And I feel, wow, it has some lovely warm water. Like I have a feeling it's something good. I've driven fast again. So it's a nice, good thing. I'm getting a pleasant feeling to, want to have a bit of a sip of it. And I want to, the intention that makes my mind move, pick up, I want to pull the object closer. I want to, and I literally want to be close to it, right? And if now there was a snake sitting here and I feel a little bit scared, how I would contact attention, then I discriminate that this is a snake, it's not. I would jump out of this chair. I would absolutely have a horrific, like feel very, very scared. And then I would get an unpleasant feeling and I would want to, absolutely leg it from here. So this is how we are sort of, our mind is operating, and every moment of mind has these. So then how can we use this to, in our quest to generate compassion, right? So we said that compassion is a mental factor, and that is, the intention is to embrace and come closer to others and not to push away, right? And that intention is determined by feeling. We must generate a positive feeling, pleasant feeling, because a positive, pleasant feeling makes your mind flow towards the object. And it really wants to go towards an embrace. And then you will not, have any problem. So then, in order to do this, intention is determined by feeling. Feeling is determined by how we discriminate and discern. So is there a way to discern neutral beings, and much later, speaking for myself, even difficult people or enemies, so-called, in such a way that they generate this pleasant feeling within us, so that my mind flows to them? So we spoke in the first session and second, His Holiness has definitely generated for CCP. You see what they are doing, or you do, and you can generate a pleasant feeling. Your mind is flowing towards them. Is this possible? And that is what is required of us. So, but to start small, like we can start slowly, because our mind, neuroscience, what is neuroplasticity? Neuroplasticity is saying now till the day I drop dead, I am able to, carry on developing my mind, and I can continuously, change things and do things and evolve. It's not that it comes to a squad halt at 50, 40, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, right? You can carry on and on. And so now, if we can, I think at our level, and the beginning point has to be, again, practically speaking, because, if we jump to some other level, it is completely not stable. And the first thing that comes along to shake that thing, conviction, will disappear from all of this. So we need to gain solid conviction and also have a very stable foundation, right? So the first starting point is that, if we can discern and discriminate what benefits we get from others. And here the teachings talk, so including neutral and difficult beings, right? And ordinarily we never do this. We never do this, because maximum we think of, like whoever is our sphere, us and our near and dear, right? Everybody else, we are, just oblivious to the neutral and difficult people. We won't even dream, right, of thinking what are we getting benefit from them. And in this context, if we start training our mind and thinking, and of course, it may not be easy. Like, some of my students, they were being a bit sarcastic. They were, ma'am, oh, you mean those gratitude videos, like be gratitude for everything? I was like, okay, yeah, like we can be cynical about it, or we can be inured to it. But in a way, this is the truth and the reality, right? So here, if we think about, so our family, of course, our near and dear ones and everything, they do give us short-term benefits. Short-term meaning for this life, there's love, affection, there's the whole cocoon, all of that, right? And, whoever you consider your near and dear. But the short-term vast benefits are anonymous people, right? Everybody who has, come up with discoveries. In my own personal case, I have autoimmune illness. All the people who discovered cortisone, I saw in the museum in Mayo Clinic in the US and all, there's a little museum there for them. All the people who developed A, B, C, D, all the, I don't know them, all the, people who have like everything from our clothes to our food that we are going to eat to these facilities, who discovered all these light and everything, and then all these other kind of experiment, discoveries and inventions and everything, and who's even providing them today and all of that. So we have a lot of things to feel grateful to neutral and just see the benefits that we are getting, right? But the long term and the most profound benefits is by really seeing if we can think about how difficult people are the ones who are really going to make us grow in ways that benefit us. And I can give my own example personally here. I'm not going to pinch Geshe-la, and that example is that, like I see that many students, if they had a superstar PhD supervisor, in many ways they benefited, right? Because many worlds opened up, regardless of the supervision that they actually got, worlds opened up, jobs opened up, all this. But if you had a supervisor who was not such a superstar and you had to kind of depend on yourself and get on with it, later you are completely self-sufficient. And you can, overcome and rise and shine in ways that, and without that training, you would not be able to. So in these ways, we can sometimes think, difficult situations or beings. I also feel actually that, if I think about a lot of my students now, some of them who've, not all, but the ones who've overcome some difficult situations, be it financial or be it personal, like, broken family or some other things, they have actually had a much greater will to do better and get on with things. And compared to somebody who has had a very sheltered and protected and great life till quite a middle age, actually, I'm not sure. I'm pretty 100% in my experience, the former is better. They are going to go much further. And that is because of the difficulties and the difficult people they faced, right? Otherwise, it's not going to be possible. And like this, we can, all these teachings, as I'm saying, as the Buddha said first, just investigate. Please don't listen to my words. Just investigate all this, you see, and by the time, you get to a certain age, I think if they are not dawning in your mind, then in any case, we are sort of, like a little bit slow, I would say, because we can see the experiences all around us, right? So now, but then to slowly extend our compassion and train that later there could come a point where it starts approximating a mother or a father's unconditional love for their child. So we are saying that let's start cognitively how we discriminate beings that I get benefit. Let's start, let's practice, let's familiarize our mind with this. And a day may come where it becomes unconditional, that even without seeing them as particular benefit coming to you, your mind just flows towards them. And because again, you can see that if you train in something, right? If you become a gymnast, you train as a marathon or something, at one point, it becomes just almost spontaneous for you. In fact, you won't be able to stop your mind flowing in such a force and such a direction and such a way and so spontaneously, right? And the one difference between mental training as opposed to physical we will drop in this life and much earlier if we stop going to the gym. But mental, of course, I don't have to every day do a PhD. Whatever training I got, hopefully it's going for the life, and then you can build upon it, stack upon it, right? So, and then again, that Bodhisattva Shantideva, he says there is nothing whatsoever that is not made easier through acquaintance to our mind, right? We can actually have infinite this thing. Now, the second part of that thing that we needed for compassion, we needed the love for other beings, right? So now we did that part, how to do it yourself, right? And here now there's a lot of, we are sitting in the land of gurus, the land of spiritual, the land of everything. And now you meet many people, and everybody has a theory on how, like, that this can be achieved, but very few times you actually get a roadmap and you actually get like how to manual 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, 5 step. And this is it. So now the second part of that definition was about seeing the suffering and the causes of suffering about beings, right? And to just remind you that here I'm, I had shared that the first two parts of my talk was, really totally secular. And so is this one. But in this one, I'm setting out why personally for me, in light of the final ontological philosophy that I have studied, I see the possibilities to develop compassion as being infinite and far more stable. This is the topic of today's chat. So in that context, I am talking now about Nalanda tradition philosophy, because this is how it has appeared to my mind and what I want to share with you. So of course, now in this philosophy, the suffering are of three types, right? There's manifest, evident, apparent suffering we can all identify in ourselves and others. Hospital, financial problem, mental problem, depression, this, that, you living in war-torn areas, everything constant all the time. The suffering of change, which is, all mundane happiness that we spoke about, the first category, where it's okay to want that happiness, but somewhere beyond the point, like, me gathering that kind of happiness, is that whatever mundane happiness is actually the nature of suffering. And how do we see this? This is very hard to see. It's not that easy, but we don't identify it as such because, we think that, this is it. But the reason it's suffering is because over time, if we expose ourselves more to it, it will reveal its true nature, right? If you tell me to keep sitting here now for 6 months and going on talking and stuff at some point, right? Or you go to, Hoskas and have, 6 dosas. After the first one, you're going to feel it's a prison, right? Or whatever. But try to see if we can subtly catch this. Then you can see that even the first dosa is like a bait. Why is it a bait? Because it's keeping me hanging around here. I don't want to put effort. I'm in a beautiful prison with air condition and swimming pool and everything. And, and I just want to better, it's like the monks' robes, these two, by the way, are to signify that we live in the mouth of death. But how much of this life I have put to better this hotel room, I can't tell you. I mean, pretty much everything till this age, right? Everything I've done is to better my situation in this hotel room that I am in till the end of this birth. So that's the bait, right? And I was in my earlier life extremely outwardly competitive. I could Cambridge and everything had to be with perfectionism. So that whole thing, it's not good enough. This is not good, then that. Then it has to be this, then it has to be that. Then it has to be this, that list. So, but that is this hotel room. That is this, bait that we keep hanging around here. And I'm not going to. And then with each successive step, as you reach it, you realize, did I really reach that happiness and you find that, it's not really what it was advertised as. And again, here, we don't need to, let's just, I'm again not at all denigrating. We need that basic, we all have to find our own balance. What is it? 30, 40, 60, 20, 50, whatever. And that also changing with age. That's up to us. That's a very individual thing. But, this is the suffering of change. And pervasive condition suffering, this is a uniquely Nalanda philosophy concept. And this is what I'm now going to talk about, because it is the heart. Its verse is the wisdom of emptiness. This is the kind of mastermind or whatever behind the first two sufferings, because basically here we say that we are conditioned by our afflictions, our contaminated karmas. We are constantly taking rebirth involuntarily, and where we continually have these first two sufferings, and basically we don't have any freedom to choose. And not having freedom is misery. But this one, we don't even identify it, let alone thinking of it as suffering. We don't even identify it. And to be honest, the whole of Buddhist philosophy, when they are talking about suffering, they are not really talking about 1 and 2. They are talking about this one. At the mostly. Those are the baby level. So then the most venerable Lobsang Gyatso Rinpoche, who set up, for those of you who know, he set up SARA, he set up the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics. He's been, key in so many institutions that are producing the finest of scholar practitioners even today. So he says that pervasive conditioned suffering, these are the 5 aggregates themselves, because they are a result of our karma and our delusions. And as their presence permeates the existence of all ordinary sentient beings equally, and because they are the very basis of the unremitting experience of the other 2 sufferings. So it is both the basis for what I'm experiencing, and it is also said in Acharya Dharmakriti's Pramana Vartika. There's a verse there that I can't remember the exact number, but it, was shocking. But it's true that, the 5 aggregates, it's the basis for all the suffering we experience, and it's also the result. So we are just in that washing machine cycle, right? And we can't get out. Except, and we'll come to that. So now then, the reflection on the ways, and they use this word transmigratory beings, but it's quite beautiful, I find, that they resemble the perpetual motion of a paddle wheel, suffering endlessly and relentlessly. So this is again from Acharya Chandrakriti's, entering the middle way. And I showed his picture last time. He's the key commentator on Arya Nagarjuna's works. He's the moon to the moon. That's why his name, Chandrakriti, to Arya Nagarjuna's, teachings, because he opens them up for us. So he says here that, when you see this, and this paddle wheel verse, by the way, you can use it for meditation. It's verse 3 we learned. And those of you who are part of Nalanda Master's course, Geshe-la will start teaching this text now soon. And this is, this little paddle wheel, you can just sit and meditate on this for a whole year. How we are this paddle wheel, how the causes for us to come crashing down is like a lift whose thing has broken, and how the causes to go up is like levitating. Sorry. But, and then you can just, this paddle wheel, we are in this. Then when you think about this, for yourself, it does induce renunciation. And what renunciation here, and this I'm totally parroting Geshe-la, and I said to Geshe-la that I would be parroting on some of this, that renunciation meaning not like renouncing all your fine home, beautiful things, families, or, that's people's personal individual choice or not, but that is not the meaning of renunciation. It is renouncing your miseries, right? It is renouncing that. Then for yourself, you really want to get out of this washing machine. And for others, when you think about them, it induces great compassion. The same thing for yourself, when you think about it, it induces, fear that I've done this so many countless lives, and here I am yet again, and then I'll carry on and on and on and on infinitely ad infinitum. And for others, it will induce great compassion. And of course, in the Buddhist context, Buddhist philosophy context, these are also, you reflect the first four aspects of the truth of suffering. So related to the 4 noble truths, the 16 aspects of the 4 noble truths, impermanence, suffering, being empty, being selfless. We can also relate it to the 4 seals of the Buddha's teachings. That, basically, whether or not you call yourself a Buddhist or anything, but if you believe in those 4 things, if you have conviction in them, that, all composite things are impermanent, all contaminated things are the nature of suffering, all phenomena of the nature of emptiness and selflessness, and transcending sorrow is peace. If you gain conviction in that, whatever you call yourself, you are, heed the words of the Buddha. So we can also reflect. And now, what is this process of coming into being of this, what we call samsara, or basically this conditioned existence that we are going about in like a washing machine? So this Arya Nagarjuna gives the whole, again, the step by step, right? So this verse goes, it's called the 5 profundities, that the ceasing of karma and afflictions leads to nirvana. Karmas and afflictions arise from inappropriate attention, which in turn arise from elaboration of self-grasping ignorance. It is the wisdom of emptiness that brings an end to ignorance and this entire stop button. So So how it works is that this samsara or nirvana that we are in, so this is a result, right? It is where we are. What is its immediate cause of all these miseries is contaminated karmas. And to put that very simply to you, those of you who are familiar, we can put it in a nutshell in the 10 non-virtues. The 10 non-virtues of body, speech, and mind. That is the contaminated karmas, the actions we take basically to break down karma. In the Indian context, everybody gets a romantic expression like they need to go and have a coffee in a cafe called Nirvana. Karma and Nirvana, both these have really, so Nirvana also will come to that later, but they have very romantic notions. So karma, we just take it as action here. Finish. So contaminated karmas are actions. So the immediate cause of the miseries. What is the immediate cause of the contaminated karmas? It is our afflictions. And these, the grosser ones we can recognize. Grosser means being less subtle. Anger, jealousy, hatred, all of that, attachment, which is, relatively harder to identify in ourselves and others. And we love to quote it in different things. But the other day I read something, and it's true actually when you think about it, that attachment, when our, that is not met, our expectations and everything, then often that leads to anger. So actually attachment is a big one, but then everyone says, oh, but should we not love anybody? So anyway, that's a different, so all these afflictions, right? What is the cause of that? Inappropriate attention. That, here's this cup and it is objectively so pleasant. It has the wonderful qualities, from its own side. And of contemporary example, when people fall in love, right, they give inappropriate attention to the object of their affection. It is like the sun rises and sets on that being and everything is, objectively positive about them. And then after 6 months, when, it doesn't work out, then everything is objectively negative about them. And then where is this inappropriate attention sitting? It is sitting on this ignorance. Now, ignorance has many, many levels. Ignorance can be, seeing impermanent as permanent, seeing, suffering as happiness, blah, 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 many, many, many. But here we are talking about the subtlest of ignorance, which is perceiving things to be objectively real, coming from the object. So that is talking about self-grasping ignorance. And its direct opposite, which is emptiness, the wisdom of emptiness. And here in particular, I'm talking, because there are various tenet schools, but I'm talking about Prasangika, Madhyamika. This is henceforth what I'm calling the final view. And it is in light of this that I feel that, one can really develop positive qualities infinitely. So we'll come to see, So then now His Holiness, ever practical, he's the most practical teacher, So he says that for Buddhist practitioners, the development of wisdom is also very important. And here I mean wisdom which realizes shunya or emptiness, the ultimate nature of reality, ultimate nature. The realizations of shunya give you at least some kind of positive sense about cessation. Once you have some kind of feeling for the possibility of sensation, then it becomes clear that suffering is not final and that there is an alternative. If there is an alternative, then it is worth making an effort, right? So then only it makes sense we are sitting here rather than having a coffee in Hoskas village. If there's no possibility to get out of this suffering and everything, then frankly, it's depressing to hear about all of it. And, why bother? Because then it's just sort of being, torturing other people, right? So if only two of the Buddha's four noble truths, suffering and the cause of suffering, then there is not much meaning. But the other two noble truths, which is basically, the path leading to cessation or nirvana, or the possibility of it, including cessation, point towards an alternative way of existence. There is then the possibility of ending suffering. So it is worthwhile to realize the nature of suffering. And therefore, wisdom is extremely important in increasing compassion infinitely. Because again, if I see this whole, working, then for myself, I also feel there's a possibility to get out. I generate renunciation, which has to be a base, for wanting to make the effort. And for others, I feel great compassion. And perhaps if one has the capacity, also responsibility that now we have to even get them out, right? So, and here then it comes that wisdom is the only liberating path. The only way to get out of this washing machine cycle is the wisdom of emptiness. It is nothing else. Everything else are just factors to aid that, to give you energy to go with that journey, to, merit and all of that. So we go back to Acharya Chandrakriti. He praises compassion at the beginning of his key text on the final view. So I said this the last time, that this entering the middle way, it's really about the wisdom of emptiness. But he begins by, paying homage to compassion. And this verse I touched on last time, that in that compassion alone is upheld as the seed. So in the beginning, it's important because it gives rise to the sprout or the results of the harvest of the perfect conqueror, as the water that nourishes it. So in the middle, it is the water that creates, the causes, conditions, and everything to nourish it. And as the ripened fruit that is the source of enjoyment of beings for long. When we all become Buddhas, then at that time, compassion is also important, because then we'll be helping others because of our compassion, right? So it is important throughout. So I shall at the beginning praise this compassion. And then he talks about, that paddle wheel verse. First with the thought I, the beings cling to a self, then with the thought mine, because immediately on the thought of I comes the mind. They become attached to things, and like a paddle wheel in motion, they have no freedom. I bow to that compassion which cares for such beings. So when you step away and you see this nature, with a bit of distance and a bit of like a lot of analysis about this, then you cannot but help but feeling compassion. And the third verse here, fourth verse goes, the conqueror's child who sees that these transmigratory beings are as fluctuating as the reflection of moon in shimmering water, and are empty of intrinsic nature, his heart falls under compassion's sway, directing it towards the total freedom of beings. So now we are coming to probably the hardest, first before we go there though, I'll come back to that verse. But before we go there, now we are talking about great compassion. So now compassion is, one of the, of course, we went through its definition and everything. So when we talk about great compassion here, we are talking about compassion that is directed to all sentient beings, and it wishes them to be free of all three kinds of suffering. So basically it has, and therefore, it has three features as opposed to immeasurable other kinds of compassion. And I won't go into that, but there are again all these different things. But this is what we need to know for today's purpose. It encompasses all sentient beings in all realms, leaving no body. To all of them, today morning, His Holiness said that, please think about every sentient being. So that is the scope. And it wishes them to be free from the three kinds of suffering. So now we are becoming a little more nuanced, like MPhil or PhD level. That all three kinds of suffering, which obviously means that then they shouldn't have afflictive obscurations and also not cognitive obscurations. So we are, aiming for that. And it serves as a causal factor to develop altruism. And we said in one of the earlier classes that what is altruism? That you take a sense of responsibility, that now if I have the capacity, I myself, I'm going to also take responsibility for other beings, right? So then the different forms of great compassion. And again, you just develop awe. And let's just take a moment to generate the wish that we always remain connected to this Nalanda tradition in all lifetimes. Because you just see the sophistication of how their thinking has been, and yet how modern. We are sitting in the 21st century, and which part of this requires any kind of belief. And this is why it is, when His Holiness has spoken about his fourth commitment as, the India rejuvenating its own Nalanda tradition, this is what he's talking about, right? Because it is so relevant, the entire mindfulness I would say, fashion of the Western world, and along with yoga, as they have seen it as a physical exercise, mindfulness part is all deriving from this tradition, right? It's one small cog in the wheel. And so therefore, the map of the mind, how to develop, what to do, how, it's so sophisticated. So now we are saying that great compassion also is not a one, there are three. So there are many, many numbers, 3 of this, 4 of that, 2 of this, 1 of this. And I love that because it's a good little list. I don't like this vague, like, you just. So great compassion, first just observing sentient beings. Then great compassion, observing their impermanence as well. In this hall today, we will all not be existent in, let's say whoever the youngest, whatever, 80 years, right? Definitely not so. And, we don't really see that. That's even gross impermanence. And gross impermanence is only possible because of subtle impermanence, which is momentary change. And we don't really see that, because if we see that again, it is, we would live completely differently. And finally, great compassion, observing the unobservable nature, right? So here then we are going from grossest to subtlest. That firstly, I feel great compassion just seeing sentient beings. Then with a mind that is influenced by an understanding of impermanence, because compassion is an affective mind, and those minds will be cognitive. The one that is understanding impermanence, that is understanding wisdom of emptiness, they will be cognitive minds. And here we are talking about an affective mind because I'm generating great compassion. So it is directly influenced by that mind. So when I have an understanding of impermanence, and it really is a realization that we are talking about here. So not an intellectual understanding, some taste of it. Then when I observe sentient beings and how they go around things, I will generate a more subtle level of great compassion. And finally, when I see that the way we are all dependently originated, empty of objective existence beings, and I have realized, got a taste of that, how I will generate great compassion is of a totally different order. And I never forget that, when His Holiness used to come for the Foundation of Universal Responsibility teachings, some of you may have attended, till about maybe 2014, 15, somewhere thereabouts. He used to sometimes stay in Taj Hotel, just on Shah Jahan Road. And he had occupied the rooms upstairs. And he said once, because there's a roundabout there, he said he would look out and just see all these beings rushing here and there. And, where are they going? And when you think about the great compassion, like, this, first you see just sentient beings always in a rush, and in Delhi, always in a rush, always with manifest great, gross affliction, anger, horn, out of our way, and all of that going on. And then they also have all this subtler level and everything going on. So first you're seeing them rushing, then you are seeing them, this impermanent, and then you're observing their real nature. And I wonder what isolate is coming to his mind. And this Geshe, our Geshe-la, Geshe Dorji Damdola's teacher, the most venerable Geshe Palden Drakpa Rinpoche, says in the soothing rays of moonlight, loving kindness and compassion, which has been published by Tibet House and will be coming out in another form also shortly, in a compendium of Rinpoche, Gen Rinpoche's teachings. He says this, thus this distinction can be understood respectively as follows. The first is an attitude that merely wishes all sentient beings to be free of the dukkha of samsara. Whereas the second is an attitude that wishes sentient beings to also be free from the dukkha that occurs due to the distortion of seeing impermanent things as permanent. So that is also an ignorance, but it's slightly, grosser level compared to the wisdom of emptiness, self-grasping ignorance, misconception. The antidote to which is the wisdom of emptiness. And the last is an attitude that wishes sentient beings to also be free from the dukkha that occurs due to the distortion of seeing non-inherently existing things as inherently existing. So we wake up, 24/7, we are just in this, so we have our conventional sleep and that conventional dream, we wake up, we feel relief because we see that it was just a dream. But then we are living in an unconventional dream. where basically things appear to us as existing objectively, and yet how they exist is completely different. So there is this huge gap between the appearance of things and the actual mode of existence, this deception. And we are in that 24/7, in the whole of the unconventional dream of our waking hours. We are in the grasp of that. And in that, it is where we think that it is completely objective and real. So how we project this samsara is that, we are constantly projecting this self-grasping ignorance is projecting this. We are unaware that we are projecting. We are believing it to be real, and then we get very, very affected. And then we want to react, and that is creating karma. And that again is keeping us bound in that washing machine cycle. And until we can, wake up from this sleep of self-grasping ignorance, we are stuck here. So then wisdom of emptiness is the only liberating factor that can get us out of this. So now, of course, how we need to establish emptiness basically as avoiding, so as the middle way, as anybody who's not even been exposed to any sort of systematic study would know that, when we talk about the middle way, we are establishing, in a sense, the Buddhist philosophy is about the middle way. So how do we establish emptiness as the middle way? And in this, we avoid the two extremes, basically nihilism, which rejects any kind of, dependent origination, the operation of cause and effect. And basically everything can seem imaginary, right? Because you may say that if everything is our projection or just, 100% subjective coming from my mind, what is the difference between imaginary? And then why do I need to have any kind of, decent behavior and all? I don't need to, follow any kind of law of cause and effect or anything, right? So that's quite dangerous. It's a wrong view that is, very, very, in some ways, misleading, because it takes you'll act in ways that are completely creating your own then further causes of misery rather than stopping them. And the other extreme is absolutism, where you see things as existing absolutely from the side of the object, right? The materialist views or whatever, it's coming directly. So to avoid falling into these two extremes, as Geshe-la is always telling us, that you just pose two questions so that you are, and the two questions are that do things exist? And the answer is definitely yes. And this will save you from a nihilist view, but more profoundly, it will save you from, not believing that you need, there's any operation of cause, effect, all of that. And, this is the most common view, like, since I ordained only recently in February, but previously also when I've attended conferences and all, many academic scholars, even of Buddhist philosophy, they will, or even the general population, they'll say, oh, Buddha said no self. There's no self. But that no self does not mean that no self exists. It is just that no objective self exists. So this is very, very critical to make this distinction, right? And then how do things exist if they exist? And the answer is subjectively, and meaning the role of the mind is there, coming from there. It is not coming absolutely from the object. And this will save you from an absolute materialist views. And therefore, you don't fall on either extreme. You're sitting on the balance of a nice in the middle, just completely balanced, right? And to quickly share, and I'm sorry to, because many of you may be old students yourselves and then have the understanding, but when we talk about dependent origination, that we can talk about various levels of it, you could say. There are three: that the dependence of results upon the causes, dependence of wholes upon parts, and the most profound and the subtlest is the dependence on mere mental designation. That it is through labeling, mental imputation that we, everything exists. So now establishing emptiness as the middle way, and emptiness so basically here, now I'm going to go back to, that verse right in the beginning. So this is just a continuation of the previous slides. So emptiness is being synonymous with dependent origination. So now we quote the verse right at the beginning that I showed, Arya Nagarjuna Gompo Lundups from the Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way. That which dependently originates is posited to be empty of independent existence. So these two lines now, what does it mean? It basically says that emptiness is not nothingness. Emptiness is just a short form for saying it is empty from the object side. So this rejects the extreme of absolutism, right? Because you are saying here that emptiness is not nothingness. Emptiness does mean you are basically rejecting things coming from the object side, right? So you are rejecting that part of it. That being dependently designated, this is the middle way. Dependently designated means object comes into being through the power of the mind, by dependence on designation of the mind. So it rejects the extreme of nihilism. Things do come into being. It's not that nothing is there, right? Now, and this is all from teachings of Geshe-la, that basically establishing how emptiness is equal to dependent origination, and then dependent origination is equal to the middle way, and therefore emptiness is equal to the middle way, right? Because that is what we wanted to do. So if we talk about how emptiness is equal to dependent origination, right? And we think about, so the first point would be emptiness. The second is that emptiness is just the short form of emptiness of independent existence. It is not meaning nothingness or whatever. It is short form for the emptiness of independent existence. Then emptiness of independent existence means nothing exists independently, right? Because we are negating independent existence. So nothing exists independently. If nothing exists independently, that means everything exists dependently, right? Everything. And everything exists by dependence means everything is dependent originated. And this is so important because two things. One, I want to link it to the previous classes where we've talked about seeing the nature of reality and dependence as our key feature of our lives, right? We can take it gross to subtle or whatever, but seeing that relating it to all our previous discussions here. And the second point is that we may not in a future life meet emptiness that easily. So if we can link it to dependent origination, Lama Tsongkhapa says that if we can do that, then in our next lives or future lives, even if we meet cause and effect and all, the penny drops. If we do this exercise of linking them. Then how is dependent origination the middle way? Because dependent rejects the extreme of absolutism, materialism, something there, right? It's dependent. Origination rejects the extreme of nihilism. You are saying that there is some origination, there is something there. It's not that nothing is there. So therefore, if you rejected the two extremes, that is the middle way, right? So now if A equals B and B equals C, A equals C. So therefore, emptiness is equal to the middle way. Now you may be wishing that you had gone for a coffee in horse cars after all. I'm sorry, but I had to complete the whole picture on, why, and this is just like, I'm just putting out a lot of things for people to just, many of you are anyway studying so seriously. But the thing is that over time, I myself have gained more and more conviction on the importance of study. Because honestly, why study important? Not in and of itself, but because it's so important to gain conviction. And conviction can only come from really studying and understanding. And that conviction, otherwise, that can be shaken. That is why I myself this morning, somebody who, earlier a little bit, I wasn't too much in that direction, but still I would think that, okay, this blessing, that. But now this morning, I did attend His Holiness teaching. I took it as a blessing. I did not really take it as something that I need to do on a daily basis as a commitment, because I've realized that without having some taste of the wisdom of emptiness and bodhicitta, or, the method side of compassion and everything, it just is gathering a lot of things to do on a daily basis. And it can approximate the worship of a god kind of thing or something, because this is the fundamental distinct feature, right? Emptiness, this philosophy of the wisdom of emptiness is what sets the Buddha's teachings apart from other traditions. At the heart of it, everything, the teachings and all forms of practice of it. So, and for this, you need a lot of, it's not that easy, right? It's like physics or economics, frankly. If somebody said to me that they want to become in 1 day or 5 classes, it is not possible. You have to study a lot, and you have to, all those steps, right? And in this case, it's even much more, because it's far, far profound, deep, philosophy about the very nature of our existence. And there, our conditioning is so deep for many lives, but even in our present life, right? And these things go at the heart of what we hold to be true about existence, about death, about, our beliefs that, who should we turn to? Should we turn to a creator God? Frankly, I started studying the path because I got ill, autoimmune, and I couldn't really convince myself about an external creator God. In that situation, I really found that the traditions in which I have grown up in, which is a Sikh family, I find that tradition amazing, because it has so much to offer: generosity, service, no ritual, all of that. But my issue was that when it came to applying it to my own problems and all, and then also relating, teaching, economics and political economy, and seeing the disparity and the inequality and the starting conditions of our lives, and then all the structural issues, inequalities later, I just couldn't square it too much with the creator God. So then I started studying this more and more and more, just to share my little bit of personal, and of course, Buddha taught, and in fact, why only Buddha? I would say all the traditions, it's for beings of many different mental dispositions, right? So frankly, at the end, I feel the practitioners of all, they come to the same point. Because if you're really genuinely, as His Holiness himself says, that, for those who believe like creator God, when it really functions for them, they behave in ways that are extremely refined and profound, right? Because they really hold that dear, that, there is going to be a judgment day, or I will, reach, or, whatever, my soul will merge with the consciousness, whatever the different, right? So that works for them. And we have as many different mental dispositions as there are sentient beings on this planet, and different planets and wherever, right? So I feel there's no one path for everybody. And we are so fortunate to be living in India, where really there is a tradition, has been in the past, of different, all traditions. And secular here has always meant respecting all traditions, of both religion and no religion also. Everybody do your own thing, celebrate the diversity, rejoice in it, because people have different dispositions, and this is such a private matter, right? And in fact, His Holiness has himself not proselytized. He's often said that please do not convert and all from your own religion of birth, because if you have any confusion about that, near death, you will become highly confused. But then we have different dispositions and everything. And again, I'm sharing all this because, it's your personal experience and conviction that is going to follow something, right? Because this is not for any external being that one is doing all this. So then, basically linking emptiness to dependent origination, there's an extract from Bodhisattva Aryadeva's 400 verses. He was the first student of Gompoludup, Arya Nagarjuna. When dependent arising is seen, ignorance does not occur. Thus, through all efforts, strive to find this subject. And aren't we lucky? Because in our daily life, we can see at least the grossest level of dependent origination all the time, right? Cause and effect. I drink a whole cup of tea, I will want to, at some point, want to go to the restroom. Cause and effect. Or we can see it in a million ways, right? And we don't need, again, so that is why, the teachings here, so, appealing. And then the extract from Lama Tsongkhapa's three principal aspects of the path, where he says that when these two realizations are concurrent, where the mere sight of infallible dependent origination concurrently destroys all mode of grasping through definite discernment, at that time the analysis of the profound view is perfected. So he's talking about the third level of dependent origination, of course. If you realize that, you realize emptiness. So that's very profound. But the point is that, these two. And then now the most difficult part of this philosophy, but the most precious, that if this is the case, that, we don't exist, we exist 100% subjectively, yet there is complete cause and effect operating within that subjectivity. To realize this is the hardest point of Madhyamika philosophy, and to gain conviction in it. That if everything, there is this discrepancy between how things appear to us objectively, how they exist 100% subjectively from our mere mental designation. And so there's a gap between how things appear, how they exist. That's the very definition of illusion, right? Therefore, everything is illusion-like. Sitting here today in Tushita, having this discussion, illusion-like, but not illusion, because there is the operation of cause and effect and functionality. How do we gain conviction in this? And like His Holiness standing on the top floor of the hotel and having that great compassion, level number 3, seeing that beings are empty of objective existence and yet feeling compassion, great compassion for them. This is, from the 37 37 practices of the Bodhisattva. Namo Lokeshwarya, you see that all phenomena neither come nor go. Still you strive solely for the benefit of beings. Supreme Guru and Protector Avalokiteshvara, to you I continually bow with body, speech, and mind. And also the extract from Arya Nagarjuna's commentary on the awakening mind. Those who understand this emptiness of all phenomena, yet also conform to the law of karma and its results. That is more amazing than amazing. That is more wondrous than wondrous. And this is something we have to put a lot of effort into, so then we can just think about it in one last thing I want to leave here. And of course, and that is the Heart Sutra. It's probably the most recited and very, very precious sutra, and the two truths. So here then let's talk about two different frames of reference. And the two frames of reference are the two different types of analysis that the mind is undertaking 24/7. Any mind has to fall into one of these two categories. Either you are undertaking ultimate analysis, which is basically where a mind goes very, very close to an object, metaphorically, to see how does it exist, right? So that is ultimate analysis, and what it finds is then the ultimate truth. And the conventional analysis that we are doing 24/7, which is basically the mind seeing it from an object from a distance, and that's the conventional truth. Conventional truth, I've come here to Tushita, I'm seeing all of you, you are seeing me, all of that. So the Heart Sutra says, and this is the most famous, as all of you know also, form is empty, which is the ultimate truth. So here, all our emotional stirs and all the drama, Hollywood drama of life comes from viewing things as objectively real. So when we see the emptiness of this objective self, whether it's of a flower, of yourself, of your nasty boss at work, of your cancer, of your A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all of that is stacked on that self-grasping ignorance. Those 5 profundities of Arya Nagarjuna. If you smash that self-grasping ignorance with the wisdom of emptiness, everything that is built on it will just collapse like the, basically, in one fell swoop. And the second line goes, emptiness is form, which is the conventional truth. So, of course, in our waking life and our like unanalyzed existence, we see emptiness is form, all of this. The diversity, all your beautiful clothes on a Saturday, your beautiful faces, the lovely thankas and deities in this gorgeous place, Tushita, and color, shape, and smell, and everything. And, and it's on this level that cause and effect and functionality is operating. So many of the masters say that if you want to enjoy this level, then don't start going and analyzing how does it exist. Because you won't find it. You just enjoy it at this level, right? And then the next two lines say that these two basically always existing with the same object as the two truths. They are entity-wise one, but they are isolate-wise different or whatever. So if you want to know more about that, I really suggest you study further, Tibet House Delhi, where I study, of course, but wherever you find that you want to study in more detail and go into all of these, because I really feel that linking this then to, first I'll just finish the last. I would like to say that why then, so now the session, this particular session, then Arya Nagarjuna says in his commentary on the awakening mind, when this emptiness as explained is thus meditated upon by yogis. So yogis is someone who's seeing emptiness directly, who doesn't have to now go through inference and all these. He just directly and not a physical yoga master or anything. No doubt there will arise in them a sentiment attached to others' welfare. So great compassion, because you will see the nature of how things exist. And at that point, the force of your mind to, be flow towards others is going to be so torrential, or like the, Niagara Falls. You can't stop it even if you wanted to go in that direction towards all beings. And, so then, of course, it's a journey of many, many lifetimes. It is a journey of many paths. This Tyata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Swaha, the different stages, paths we need to go through. But I just want to say that, when we see this possibility through reasoning, through gaining conviction, study, reflection, meditation, that's why these three things are so important, that if we can do these, because we have a precious human life, because we have all the 18 opportune conditions, because those are very, very rare, and because it's very rare to meet these teachings and such teachers and such a possibility, it comes along once in a blue moon. Why not make the most of this life? And, those of us living, actually nowadays the whole world, but those of us living in the global south or whatever, I would say that we have umpteen opportunity daily to reflect on even our particular conditions of our lives. We have leisure, we have all the things, right? And then we are still, if we then choose to remain in the washing machine cycle, that would be absolutely tragic. So with that, I want to just make prayers that may we always meet with these teachings in all our lives, the Nalanda tradition. May we always meet with the teachers who unfold them for us. May all the teachers, may His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, all the teachers, our teachers, Geshe Dorji Damdullah, all the teachers have very long and stable lives. May all the big centers of learning, monastic institutions, others, all of them flourish, including FPMT and Tushita Center. May Kyabje Zopa Rinpoche's show us his face once again very, very soon. May all of us become the best version of ourselves in this life, and then, of course, become enlightened as quickly as possible to help as many as possible, because it's possible. Thank you.
I would like to take a moment to thank Venerable Tenzin Wisel Munkila on behalf of Tushita and all of us here. So this is on behalf of Tushita.
Oh, okay.
And this is on behalf of KPLG. This comes from Laudo, actually, the Sri Long Life Deities. So,
oh.
please live long.
Oh, thank you.
I would like to invite you to come back after the summer break. So now Tushita will close for 2 months. And please come back and teach again at Tushita.
Thank you so much, Nico. Thank you. And thank you, Kabirji. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
If you have questions for Venerable, please feel free to ask, both in person and online. Then we can do 2 or 3 questions maybe.
Yeah, 2 or 3. And if you can just keep them a bit short, so I can paraphrase them, because there was feedback in the last 2 that they were not audible. So if they can be a little bit focused so I can paraphrase them, that would be great. Yeah, please, in person.
Thank you very much for this talk. I'm interested in how you apply, once one gains some more understanding of wisdom and its results in compassion, how does one apply that in a conventional, say, in your case, like an academic situation, and for me, it's like in a policy situation, how do I translate it into action and language that can change the world? So how do I implement that in the conventional world?
In the conventional. Thank you so much. What's your name?
Adam.
Adam. So Adam was asking that how does one apply these, what we have learned or know about emptiness and compassion, wisdom of emptiness and compassion in the real world in a policy context, or how I have applied it in an academic setting or in any setting. So I think there, His Holiness is beyond prescient. And there I feel that Adam, this is why he's insisted on universal ethics, as a principles. So I think that going back to that basic, that if we just rely on the principles of our common humanity and interdependence, these 2 things, so then we can try to apply that in our daily lives in the context of, whatever situation one is in. So I think here, the people who have been exposed to this philosophy have a bit of a responsibility to be a part of those worlds. Firstly, to take as much responsibility as possible, because the starting point in this philosophy is that you are not just working for yourself. The Mahayana path, or it is about helping others, and it is also about being there for them. So I think in the context of a policy world and in an academic world, what I have tried to do is, of course, I taught a version of this, but in a totally secular way. The first 2 and all of this thinking has come a lot out of that teaching that I did. But my main teaching is in political economy. And the state of the world is, rather what it is, we all know. And the policy world is also. So there I would say that, to be Adam, to keep going, to have the energy to keep going and make whatever beneficial contributions one can, when one gets tired, because that is a reality, to step back and try to get energy from seeing that, what is the nature of this world, at whatever level we understand, of course, I haven't got those, and then even about compassion, but at whatever baby levels, like personally speaking, people who head big institutions and all, I really, I had a chance for a year, and it was a difficult, because you are taking responsibility for many, all of that. So I think for people who can step back and get energy from thinking about these 2 things, and then go back out there and again do their daily activities, and do that as a contribution, because in a way, I think there's a lot of learning from those situations, because I think, it has again now come to me very strongly that, if I was sitting alone in a very nice mountainous Bhutanese hermitage, I may think that I've reached quite far on the path, to be honest. But it is in your daily grind of, the commute, the family situation, the job, the A, the B, the C, the D. But there is also possibility there. Because, for example, I personally have been extremely fortunate with colleagues, with students. Even this was interdependence, because the kind of questions the students posed to me and all, and then the very fact of my having to teach some of it, and then anticipate how they would think about things, and then some I couldn't even anticipate. It really made me think about things differently. Similarly, with colleagues, extremely open-minded. They gave me leave to go down south and become principal of the Dalai Lama College. They did my teaching in the meantime, everything, just for no reason. So I feel that field of practice, whatever it is for people, it can be, a job, it can be a hospital, it can be your family, it can be your whatever. But I think some sort of interaction and everything to really make these teachings live and ourselves see how far we have really got. I see now that without that, it is impossible. Of course, there are beings who have the, like in this life and all, maybe they have the conditions to be a hermit and all. But I would say it's very advanced level beings. For the rest of us, I think it's in those contexts that, again, we will be the first beneficiary. Because to be honest, it's not that easy to develop to these levels, right? Either of the two wings. So I think unless we have that opportunity, and again, when we are doing practice, we again see that other beings are providing that opportunity, right? Because if I don't have to interact with anybody, I think there's no way to progress. My personal experience.
Yes.
I hope that's helpful. And not to give up hope, because in a setting where, say that, somebody asked this question last time, that if you're part of an institution and, there's a lot of rules and regulations and you are not that high up, and how do you, so there I feel that whatever your sphere, you try to do your best and keep your energy up, because it's important, right? If all the good people or the reflective, introspective people withdraw, then anyway, we've given up. So that's why the courage. Thank you. You reminded me. Compassion and courage. The courage part comes here.
Yeah.
That, we don't just give up.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
Well, it's rather it's your views really, that we live in a world of very unfairness, hostility, everything going on, and we see this all the time. And so challenging those things, is that it's not, so would you class as a not compassion? Is it the challenge? Or are we causing sort of infliction ourselves and the other people?
So thank you, Jatinder ji. So this is true. We do live in very, very, interesting times, as the saying goes, and I would say more than interesting. And extremely challenging in many levels, and globally, I would say. I would say here that, when you say challenging, I would say that this is where the skillful means, I mentioned this last time, or that, one can even display, firstly, it's all depends on your intention, right? So at times you may outwardly appear like you are not being very kind, or, whatever. So we spoke about wrathful compassion also, which I shared. Students and other people really love that term. But the point is that at times you may show a face that is quite, cut and dried, action oriented, and even a little bit displeased or whatever, and everything, depending on what level and everything. But if your intention is good, then I think, that counts for something. Whereas if you have a very sweet face and you are donating $2 million, and inside your, real motivation is that you get an ex-campus, or you are able to, do some more business and all, then it, so here that would be one response. The second, I would say that if you can, just start with one's own small sphere. Like obviously, so in my sphere, it would be that my students, right? My students, my classroom. That was the best part of my being an academic. or through, maybe you're writing a little bit if people get influenced, right? And that's what I could do. And I see that all around me. I am surrounded by people who are making efforts in their respective spheres, despite the larger macro picture is pretty depressing, and they are going, against all sorts of, but they are really doing this. And in fact, far braver than me, because in many cases, they are also taking on, regimes and this and that, and doing very, so I think that, each one sees their own, but definitely we can't in a day say that, I'm going to challenge. Like, it would be unskillful to just sort of, say, for example, you are opposing some, then you just put everything out there and next day you are shut down. I don't think that's very skillful, right? One has to think, how do I keep being part of the game, and then doing what I have to, slowly influencing and things. And then, and then depending, like, of course, His Holiness and all, now the level at which he can influence and reach out to people and all is what we are not there by the power of his past prayers, his past lives, his past, motivation. But I think we all should aspire there, and we should never, ever resign or give up.
It's so easy to be quiet and just live your life. But when you challenge something, you can see around you what's going on, and totally unfair or very hostile environment, then you have to challenge it. When you challenge it, you get the challenge back. So,
but exactly, this is the point, Jitendra, to join your thing to Adam's. That, pleasant feeling flowing towards difficult people is not going to come in a Bhutanese hermitage. And if there was a little pill that Pfizer, created to just pop it, and no, it won't happen. So this is going to happen in all these situations. And if you think about it today, His Holiness standing up to China. Even a modern countries can't do that. So.
Thank you.
It's like China, yeah. Maybe that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for these 3 wonderful sessions. And please come back after the summer break. Really appreciate your teachings, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just would like to make a few points about Tushita. So as you might be aware, the center is entirely funded on donations only. So for example, we don't own this place, we rent it, and very often we need to, fix things here and there. And so your help is greatly appreciated. There is a QR code at the back, there is a donation box, and also on our website for those who are watching online, you can contribute to the center. Thank you so much. And so we will break soon for summer. We'll be closed in June and July. But in the meantime, we have quite a few activities happening. Actually, the next one in person is on Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. We'll have a Vajrasattva purification practice. So you're most welcome to attend in person and online as well. And then on Thursday is actually Buddha Purnima, or Sakadawa Duchen in Tibet. So we'll meet here at 11 a.m. I think it's a bank holiday, right, in Delhi? People don't go to the office on that day, right? So you're most welcome to join us at 11 a.m. And we will recite a short sutra that is called the Sutra Remembering the Three Jewels. And we will also engage in the Buddha Shakyamuni Puja. Actually, Buddha Purnima is the festival to celebrate the birth, the achieving of awakening, and the passing into parinirvana of Buddha Shakyamuni. So we'll celebrate him in that way by doing a puja, Buddha Shakyamuni Puja. You're most welcome to join for that. And then in the afternoon, actually, if you are free, with Geshe Damdul and Tibet House, we are going to the National Museum where there are Buddha relics. So you're most welcome to come. This is at 3 p.m. And then at 6 p.m., Geshe Damdul at Tibet House will lead the ceremony of undertaking the ceremony of taking the aspiring Bodhisattva vow. So this is a beautiful practice that we often engage in at Tibet House. You're most welcome to join us for that. So this will be a full day of celebrating Buddha Purnima in that way. Then from Monday to Friday, we have, as you know, the morning meditation. So this is taking place from 9 to 9:30. online on Zoom. So you're most welcome to join from your home. Yes. And then please join our WhatsApp group if you're not part of the WhatsApp group yet to be informed about our future events. There is also a QR code, I think, in the staircase. You can scan the code and join the group. And for those who are online, you will find it on our website, tushitadelhi.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll just quickly recite 2 verses for just auspiciousness. Jang Chup San Chuk Rinpoche Ma Ke Panam Ke Go Chek Ke Panam Pa Me Pa Yang Gong Ni Gong Du Pel War Shok Tong Ni Ta Wa Rinpoche Ma Ke Panam Ke Go Chek Ke pa nam pa me pa yang gong ni gong du fel war shok. Thank you.